She was 22 years old when her father drew his last breath in a narrow bed by the window, and with it he left her not money, not land, but a single whispered instruction that made no sense to anyone who heard it. Her father, Josiah Vain, a quiet lighthouse keeper's son turned coastal surveyor, had spent his final weeks fevered and drifting. But in his last lucid hour, he gripped her hand and told her to go to the old Watchtower above Grey Hollow Point, the one abandoned since the war, and to climb it, no matter what anyone said. She had $11 to her name and a trunk of her father's charts, and when the bank foreclosed on their small house within the month, she used what little she had to lease the crumbling tower and its half-acre of rocky bluff from the county for almost nothing. A purchase the whole fishing village called the last foolish act of a grieving, penniless girl. But sealed at the top of that forgotten tower, behind stone no one had touched in 20 years, waited something that would not only settle her father's final debt to a truth long buried, but would restore to an entire village what the sea itself had once seemed to steal from it forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelaide Vain. If you've ever carried out a promise to someone you loved, even when it made no sense to anyone else, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Before we go further into Adelaide's story, if you find yourself drawn into these quiet, patient tales of women the world too easily overlooked, we would be so grateful if you'd take a moment now to follow or subscribe to this channel, so that you never miss the next story we have to tell. Adelaide Vain had grown up in the salt-scoured village of Grey Hollow Point, a scattering of clapboard houses and weathered docks along the Maine coast, where the Atlantic wind never quite stopped moving, and the fog rolled in most mornings like a held breath finally released. Her father, Josiah, had been born in that watchtower itself, in the keeper's quarters at its base, back when it had stood as a manned lookout station built during the war years to watch for enemy ships along the northern coast, long before it was decommissioned and left to the gulls and the weather. Josiah's own father, Adelaide's grandfather, had kept that tower faithfully for over a decade, and though Josiah had grown into a surveyor's trade rather than a keeper's life, he had never quite left the tower behind in his heart, and he told his daughter stories of it from her earliest years. Stories of foghorns and storm watches, and the particular hush that settled over a man alone at the top of the world, with nothing but the sea for company. What Josiah gave his daughter, more than any story, was his trade itself, for he had no son, and saw no reason a daughter's hands could not learn to read a chart, or a compass, or a stretch of shoreline as well as any man's. From the time she was 7 years old, Adelaide sat at her father's drafting table in the evenings, learning to read the language of coastlines, the way currents shaped a bay, the way a cliff face told the story of centuries of tide and storm if a person only knew how to look. She learned to use his old brass sextant, to plot a position from the stars, to understand that the sea rarely gave up its secrets to the hasty or the careless, only to those willing to watch and wait and record faithfully what they saw, even when it seemed to mean nothing at the time. Her mother had died of a lung fever when Adelaide was small, and so it had been father and daughter alone in their modest house above the harbor, bound together by grief and by the quiet, steady rhythm of Josiah's work, which took him up and down the coast surveying property lines and shoal waters for the county and for the shipping concerns that still, in those years, depended on accurate charts to keep their vessels off the rocks. Josiah Vain was well respected in Grey Hollow Point. Not a wealthy man, but an honest one. The kind of man other men trusted to measure a boundary fairly even when a dishonest measurement might have profited someone with influence. It was this very honesty, Adelaide would later come to understand, that had cost her father something long before she was born, though she did not know the shape of that cost until much later. As a girl, She only knew that her father sometimes grew quiet and distant when the old watchtower came up in conversation, that he would gaze toward it from their kitchen window with an expression she could not name, something between longing and old grief, and that he always turned the subject aside gently whenever she asked why the tower had truly been abandoned. When the official story spoke only of the war ending and the need for a lookout station passing with it, she grew up believing there was more to that story than anyone in the village cared to say aloud, and she filed the feeling away the way her father had taught her to file away every small, unexplained detail of a coastline, trusting that patterns eventually revealed themselves to those willing to keep watching. Adelaide's growing years were not easy ones, marked by her family's modest means, and by a village that, for all its warmth, could be a narrow and gossiping place, quick to remark on a motherless girl who spent more time with charts and sextants than with needlework or courting. But she had her father's steady love and his patient teaching, and by the time she was 17 she was accompanying him on survey work herself, rowing him out to mark shoal lines, holding the chain steady while he measured a boundary, learning firsthand the discipline of careful, honest observation that would, though she could not have known it then, prove to be the very inheritance that mattered most when everything else was taken from her. By the time Adelaide reached her 20th year, her father's health had begun to fail. A slow-wasting sickness the village doctor could neither properly name nor properly treat, and the two of them watched their small savings dwindle as Josiah's survey commissions grew fewer and his strength grew less. Adelaide took in mending and laundry to help stretch what money remained, rising before dawn to scrub other families' linens before spending her afternoons at her father's bedside, reading him the shipping news from Portland and trying, with a determination that cost her more than she ever let him see, to keep some cheer in their small house, even as she watched him grow thinner and more distant by the week. It was during those long final months that Josiah began speaking, in his more lucid hours, of the Watchtower with an urgency that unsettled her, telling her that there was something at the top of it, something he had left there himself many years before, something that needed setting right, though fever and exhaustion kept him from ever quite explaining what he meant. He died on a gray October morning in 1889, with the fog thick over the harbor and the foghorn from the working lighthouse further down the point sounding low and mournful through the mist. And his last words to her, gripped out through failing breath, were the instruction that would change everything. Go to the Watchtower. Climb to the top, no matter what anyone tells you. Adelaide buried her father with what little money remained, and within weeks of the funeral, the modest house they had rented came under threat of eviction, its owner unwilling to extend further credit to a young woman alone with no income and no family name carrying weight enough to secure her patience from her creditors. She sold what furniture she could, kept only her father's charts, his sextant, and a small trunk of clothes, and found herself, at 22 years old, standing in the county clerk's office with $11 in her hand, the whole of what remained to her in the world. It was there, almost on impulse, though she told herself later it had been her father's voice guiding her hand, that she asked the clerk about the old Watchtower's status, and learned that the county had long ago taken possession of the abandoned structure and its small parcel of rocky land for unpaid back taxes from decades past, and that no one had shown the slightest interest in leasing or purchasing so useless and crumbling a property in all the years since. The clerk, a kindly enough man named Perkins, told her plainly that the tower was condemned, its stairs rotted, its stonework unsafe, and that she would be wiser to spend her $11 on lodging than on a ruin no sensible person would want. But Adelaide thought of her father's last words, of the strange, urgent weight he had placed on that instruction even as death closed over him, and she paid the small lease fee the clerk named, becoming, for all practical purposes, the owner of a condemned tower that the entire village agreed was worth nothing at all. A decision that made her, in the eyes of Grey Hollow Point, the very picture of a grieving girl gone slightly foolish with loss. She walked out to the point the very next morning, her father's old climbing rope coiled over her shoulder, a lantern in her hand, and stood at the base of the Watchtower for a long while before she found the courage to begin her ascent. The tower rose some 60 feet above the rocky bluff, its gray stone walls streaked with lichen and salt, its narrow windows dark and empty like the sockets of some old sea creature's skull, and the wooden stairway within, when she finally forced the swollen door open, proved every bit as treacherous as Perkins had warned. Several steps rotted through entirely, forcing her to test each board with careful pressure before trusting her weight to it. She climbed slowly, her lantern throwing long, trembling shadows against the curved stone walls, past the old keeper's quarters on the second level where her grandfather had once lived, past a storage room cluttered with the rusted remains of old lamp equipment and coiled, ruined rope, until at last she reached the topmost chamber, the watchroom itself, where the great glass windows that had once let a keeper scan the horizon for enemy sail now stood cracked and clouded with decades of salt grime. It was in that topmost chamber that she found the first clue her father's dying words had promised her. Built into the stone beneath the old watchbench was a small iron strongbox, rusted nearly solid, which took her the better part of an hour with a chisel from her father's tool roll to finally pry open. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had somehow kept the damp mostly at bay, she found a bundle of papers in her father's own younger hand, dated to the final year of the war, along with a brass keeper's badge she did not recognize, and a small, tarnished ring that was not her father's, and not, she was certain, meant for a man's hand at all. The papers, once she had carried them down carefully and spread them by lamplight in her rented room that evening, told a story that reshaped everything Adelaide believed about her father's quiet sorrow. Josiah Vain, it turned out, had not simply been born in that tower and left it behind for a surveyor's trade, as she had always believed. He had, in the final year of the war, served briefly as an assistant to his own father in the tower's watch duties, and during that time, a great storm had driven a merchant vessel onto the rocks below the point, a wreck that claimed most hands aboard but left one survivor. A young woman named Constance, whom Josiah and his father had pulled half-drowned from the surf and sheltered in the tower's keeper's quarters while she recovered. Josiah's papers, written in the raw, unguarded hand of a young man, spoke of falling swiftly and completely in love with Constance during the weeks of her recovery, and of Constance confiding in him a secret she trusted to no one else in the village, that she had been traveling under an assumed name, fleeing a wealthy Boston family and a marriage arranged against her will, carrying with her a small fortune in her own right, jewelry and bonds inherited from her late mother, which she had hidden, fearing discovery, in the one place she trusted completely, sealed within the stonework of the tower's topmost chamber, behind a loose block she and Josiah had worked free together during her recovery, meaning to retrieve it once it was safe for her to reveal herself and claim her own inheritance openly. But the papers took a darker turn from there. Constance had grown well enough to travel just as the war's end brought chaos and shifting authority to the coast, and she left the tower one morning to travel to Portland, intending to consult a lawyer about her situation, promising Josiah she would return within the fortnight to reclaim what she had hidden and to give him, as the letters made achingly clear, an answer to a question he had asked her the night before she left. She never returned. Josiah's later notes, written in a hand grown older and more controlled, recorded that he had made inquiries for years afterward, and learned only that a young woman answering Constance's description had drowned in a ferry accident crossing to Portland that same week. Her body never recovered. Her true identity apparently never established by the authorities who handled the wreck. Josiah's grief, it seemed, had been twofold: the loss of the young woman he had loved, and the unbearable weight of a promise he had made to guard her secret and her hidden fortune. A promise he felt he could not break even in death, not knowing if some other Ferris relation might yet appear with rightful claim, not wanting to enrich himself with a dead woman's hidden inheritance. And so he had simply sealed the chamber's secret away with his silence, left the tower behind, and carried the burden of it quietly for the rest of his life. Only at the very end finding the peace, or perhaps the desperation, to pass the unfinished promise on to his daughter. Adelaide read those papers 3 times through the night, her father's grief rising up from the page and settling over her like a second morning atop her own. And she understood now why he had gazed at the tower so often with that unnamed sorrow in his eyes. Why he had never remarried. Why he had kept, all those years, a small tarnished ring he had never explained. She returned to the tower the very next day and worked the loose block free from behind the old watch bench exactly as the papers described. And there, wrapped in cloth gone dark and brittle with age, she found Constance Ferris's hidden fortune, a modest but genuine collection of jewelry, several sealed bonds bearing a Boston bank's markings, and a final letter in Constance's own hand, addressed simply to whoever finds this, should I not return, explaining her situation in full and expressing her wish. Should the worst befall her, that whatever she had hidden be used not for any distant Ferris relation who had never cared for her, but for the good of the small coastal village that had sheltered her in her time of greatest need. Word of Adelaide's discovery could not be kept quiet for long in a village as small as Grey Hollow Point, and within days the wrong sort of attention arrived in the person of Bartholomew Croft, a Portland attorney who had, it emerged, spent years quietly representing the Ferris family estate in Boston, searching intermittently for any trace of the missing daughter's inheritance, which had never been properly settled after her presumed death. Croft arrived at Grey Hollow Point within the fortnight, smooth-mannered and sharply dressed, and presented himself to Adelaide as though doing her a great favor by relieving her of a legal complication she could not possibly understand, informing her that any property belonging to the Ferris estate rightfully reverted to the surviving Ferris relations in Boston, regardless of where or how it was found, and that her wisest course was to hand the entire cachet over to him immediately in exchange for a modest finder's payment, well below even a fraction of the fortune's true worth. Adelaide, however, had Constance's own final letter, clearly expressing her wish that the fortune serve the village should she not return to claim it herself. And she had, too. Her father's careful legal instincts passed down through years of survey work that required knowing exactly what a document could and could not prove. She refused Croft's offer politely but firmly, and when he grew insistent, even faintly threatening, hinting that he could make her ownership of the tower and its contents the subject of a lengthy and costly legal dispute she could not possibly afford to fight, she sought out the same clerk, Perkins, who had sold her the lease, and through him found a young Portland lawyer named Nathaniel Rourke, willing to review Constance's letter and the accompanying papers without charge, intrigued by the unusual case. Rourke confirmed what Adelaide had begun to suspect on her own, that Constance's clearly expressed final wish, combined with the fact that she had died under an assumed identity never legally connected by the Ferris family to their missing daughter until Croft's own recent inquiries, gave Adelaide's claim as the tower's rightful leaseholder and the one who had fulfilled the dead woman's own stated intention, a legal standing at least as strong as any distant relations, particularly since the Ferris family had made no effort in over 20 years to locate their missing kinswoman themselves, content instead to let her simply vanish from their concern until money surfaced that might be worth claiming. Croft did not give up easily. He spent weeks pressuring merchants in the village not to extend Adelaide credit, spreading word that her claim to the tower's find was likely fraudulent, even suggesting, in tones just careful enough to avoid outright slander, that a young woman living alone might have simply invented the whole convenient story of a dead heiress's hidden fortune. Adelaide bore this campaign with the same steady patience her father had taught her over a drafting table years before, refusing to be rushed into a settlement, gathering instead every scrap of corroborating evidence Rourke advised her to collect, the ferry accident records from Portland, matched against Constance's known travel dates, testimony from two elderly villagers who remembered the shipwreck and the young woman sheltered afterward in the tower, and her father's own detailed written account, which, whatever grief and secrecy had kept it silent for 2 decades, now proved itself entirely consistent and utterly convincing when laid before a Portland judge. When the matter finally came to a formal hearing that winter, Croft's case collapsed under the weight of Constance's own clearly written wish and the corroborated history Adelaide had so carefully assembled, and the court ruled that the fortune, having been abandoned by the Ferris family's own decades of indifference and claimed properly under Constance's expressed final intention, belonged rightfully to Adelaide Vain as the tower's leaseholder, and the one who had honored the dead woman's true wish. Croft left Grey Hollow Point in quiet defeat, his reputation among Portland's legal circles somewhat diminished by a case he had pursued with such open greed, and he was not troubled to return. With the fortune finally and legally hers, Adelaide did not keep it locked away for her own comfort alone, understanding as she did the full weight of what Constance had asked in that final letter, and what her own father had silently carried for 20 years rather than betray. She used a portion to settle her own modest debts and secure a comfortable, independent living for herself, at last free of any landlord's mercy or any relative's grudging charity. But the greater share she directed, guided by Nathaniel Rourke's careful counsel, toward the good of Grey Hollow Point itself, just as Constance had wished. She funded the restoration of the small village schoolhouse, which had stood in disrepair for years for lack of county funds, and established a scholarship in Constance Ferris's name for village daughters wishing to continue their education beyond what the local school could offer. A gift that would, over the years that followed, send more than a dozen young women from that small fishing village onto lives their mothers could scarcely have imagined for them. She paid for a proper new breakwater to be built along the harbor's most exposed stretch, the very stretch of coast that had claimed Constance's ship all those years before, and had claimed other vessels since, a project the village had needed desperately but never had the funds to undertake. And she restored the old Watchtower itself, not as a private residence, but as a small maritime museum and lookout point open to the village and to travelers, where her father's charts and Constance's story were displayed together with quiet dignity, a testament to a promise finally kept, and a secret finally allowed to serve the very community it had, for so long and so silently, waited to help. That is the true shape of what Adelaide Vain found at the top of that forgotten watchtower, 22 years old and grieving, with $11 to her name, and nothing but her father's strange dying words to guide her. She had climbed those rotting stairs not knowing whether she would find anything at all. And what she found instead was not merely a fortune sealed away in stone, but the unfinished story of her own father's quiet, faithful heart, and a chance to complete the promise his grief had never let him keep. She restored to Grey Hollow Point what the sea had taken from it in more ways than one, and in doing so she proved that her father's steady teaching, that patient, careful observation, reveals what haste and greed will always miss, had been the truest inheritance he ever could have left her, worth infinitely more than any money could measure. She kept, for the rest of her life, the small tarnished ring her father had never explained, and Constance Ferris's final letter framed beside it in the restored tower's watchroom. A quiet reminder that some promises outlast even the ones who make them. Waiting patiently. As her father always said, the mountain and the sea both waited for someone willing to climb high enough and look closely enough to finally set them right. Thank you so much for climbing this story all the way to its end with us tonight. If Adelaide's patience and her father's quiet, unfinished promise moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share this video with someone who might need the reminder that even the most forgotten places can hold something worth finding, if only someone is willing to look. We would love to know in the comments, what is a promise, large or small, that you have carried faithfully for someone you loved? Until next time, stay close.